Jone Johnson Lewis is a semi-retired ethical culture leader. I think most of us are, aren't we, Joan? She was the interim clergy leader here at Brooklyn Ethical during the 2010 decade, and has also served societies in Chicago, Northern Virginia, and Riverdale-Yonkers. She's emerging from a year-plus-long battle with cancer. And I just want to add some more to your bio, Joan, because I don't know how much you're aware, but so many of the resources that we use on congregational development at the American Ethical Union are from Joan. Our board orientation materials, our, how to, relate to one another in a congregation. She helped to introduce the National Leaders Council to so much of this information, these resources. And with Joy McConnell also taught us nonviolent communication. There were just so many areas, I have to say, in my leadership training where I look to you, Joan, for your leadership and your mentorship. And I just really want to let everyone know that she's more than this short bio that you provided. We don't have time for all of it, but I want you to know just what a rich and deep resource Joan has always provided, and with her heart ethics, this deep compassion that she's shown for every individual and for the movement. So Joan, I hand it over to you now, and I'm looking forward to hearing your talk.
Thank you, Anne. Good morning, or good afternoon, rather. I'm really glad to be here. I had hoped to be here in person, but unfortunately, some new meds I'm on are problematic, including compromising my immune system. So I can't really be in groups of people right now. I've been dealing with cancer, for those who don't know, over the last year and a half. With the meds I'm taking now, the chances of recurrence are very low. I'm very grateful for the support of this society and some of its members in particular in this long journey. The short version is I'm glad to be here in whatever form. I want to begin this morning's platform talk on the heart of ethics with a story about two families in very different weather from the fall weather we're experiencing, and in a different time. Their weather was beautiful swimming weather, and the time was the summer of 2000. As told by Daisaku Ikeda, an educator and peace advocate who is president of a 12 million member Buddhist movement, Soko Gakkai, this event took place on the shore of Lake Tiberias, on the border between Israel and Syria. These two families with young children were enjoying themselves at the lake when one of the children, who was swimming in the lake, appeared to be in distress, about to drown. The other father noticed the child's panic and went out into the water to help the child back to the shallow water. Exhausted himself from the effort, the father could not himself make it back to shore, although he got the child safely back. He drowned. The father drowned. The families didn't know each other. The father, who answered the distress of a stranger's child, did so impulsively, without letting himself be stopped by the obvious risk. The family of the rescued child was Jewish. The family with the father who died in the rescue was Muslim. This small act of courage was published in a report by the United Nations right after 9/11/2001. We often ask in ethics what motivates people like the 9/11 hijackers or Hitler and the Nazis, and what their acts mean for ethical living. We ask what motivates people to kill children because the adults have different beliefs. We ask less often about people like that father who was moved to rescue the child of strangers. We ask less often about the many rescuers who kept people from the Nazis. It's my conviction that in looking at such people who are moved to rescue others in the face of personal risk, that we find much that is instructive about how to cultivate more ethical living in ourselves, in our children, and in our wider communities. As Anne said earlier, our ethical movement has often, from the beginning, used the metaphor of head, heart, and hands for what is important in cultivating more ethical living. And so today I want to be talking about the heart of ethics. I consider compassion to be the heart of ethics. To cultivate ethics means not only paying attention to what we think and what we do, but also to what we feel. Cultivating more ethical living requires that we cultivate compassion, by which I mean the urge to act out of empathy and concern. So what is compassion? I first want to distinguish empathy from compassion. There are three words in English, actually: compassion, empathy, and sympathy, which all come from the root word pathos, meaning feeling or suffering, and a prefix that means with or together with, so suffering with or feeling with. And that's part of the human experience. But these three words have somewhat different connotations. When I use the word empathy, what I mean is to notice and understand the feelings that others are going through. Empathy doesn't require that we agree that the sufferings or feelings are what we would feel in similar circumstances. It means we understand that the other person is feeling that way. We notice if they are in distress or contentment. Sympathy is often used to mean that we feel empathy for another and we agree with them and feel the same way. We connect with another through a shared experience of feeling. Compassion, as I'm using the term, and as I understand it used most often when philosophers and religious thinkers are using it, is about empathy plus concern or care or love. In compassion, we both notice that someone is in distress, and we care enough about that distress to do something about it, to do something that will give that person relief or justice. If we notice contentment, we care enough to want to do what's in our power to prolong that contentment. In compassion, we accept the humanity of the other person enough to recognize that their distress, or contentment, and to react to it with our own humanity. Both empathy and concern are necessary for compassion. Without empathy, concern can be oppressive. If we don't understand why someone is distressed or content, our actions aren't likely to be effective. But without concern, our empathy may be without action. Or any action that we do may be merely a rote duty or a social exchange. More deeply concerning is this: empathy without concern is used by sociopaths to understand and predict the feelings of others, and then use those feelings for the sociopath's own purposes. They have no concern. Empathy has its place in ethics and is a part of compassion, but it is not enough. So what does science teach us about compassion? Scientific studies of many kinds seem to confirm that human beings are capable of compassion, that compassion is natural, not artificial, that it's not merely a social construction. The term often used in scientific studies is empathic concern, both understanding and care, which is the definition of compassion that I'm using. We seem to be hardwired as human beings, with some variation in how much of this individuals have, to have an altruistic concern to reassure and console others in distress, and to act to alleviate the source of their distress. Other animals also have similar urges, and urges to act to the limits of their cognitive and problem-solving abilities to get to the source of the distress. Studies have shown that when we imagine ourselves to be in the place of another who is in distress or pain, our brains react chemically and electrically as if we were in pain. This sense of sympathy seems to be built in, at least to the extent that we feel the pain of another. Interestingly, though, when we imagine the distress of another rather than ourselves, the brain reacts a bit differently. We have the part of the brain that acts the same as if we were in pain, but when we're looking at someone else's pain, other parts of the brain are also triggered that are not triggered with our own distress. Those parts which distinguish self from others. It is the triggering of those parts that can move us toward action. If we see compassion as empathy or even sympathy, plus care enough to act on the problems, even while knowing that it is the pain of another and not our own, we see that the emotion of compassion seems to be part of what it means to be human. We also know that this compassion can be trained out of us, or trained and cultivated to be more likely to be exercised. Perhaps this was one of the reasons that religion developed and survived so strongly in human history, to help human beings cultivate compassion. Religions have also had other purposes, like keeping social order, and may limit compassion to some groups and not others. But every known religious system has some teaching about compassion. So what is the role of compassion in the world's belief systems? Felix Adler, whose ideas and teachings were key in the founding and the first 55 years of this movement's history, once wrote, "To care for anyone else enough to make their problems one's own is ever the beginning of one's real ethical development." Caring enough to act to help others has always been the core, the heart of ethical culture. Whatever you think of some of the beliefs of other systems, like religions and philosophies, every faith tradition of the world has, in addition to their separate beliefs, teachings about compassion. It's clearly one of the key roles that religion has played in human life, to cultivate compassion. One can argue whether religious groups are able to stress this above other purposes and beliefs, but perhaps one reason we get so disgusted or angry about religions that seem to promote hatred and violence is that we do deep down expect them to fulfill that role of cultivating compassionate action. The story with which I began was told by a Buddhist about a Jewish child and a Muslim father. Buddhism is one of those Eastern faiths that the philosopher Mortimer Adler wrote off as mere systems of ethics. Well, Buddhism has had more than 2,000 years more time than ethical culture to look at and examine how to cultivate ethical living. There's a story in Buddhism about Ananda, a core disciple of the Buddha, asking the Buddha whether cultivating compassion and loving kindness were a part of the practice that the Buddha was teaching. The Buddha said no. Cultivating compassion and loving kindness were all of the practice. And within Tibetan Buddhism, Tenzin Gyatso, the 14th and current Dalai Lama, said, "If you want others to be happy, practice compassion. If you want to be happy, practice compassion. Confucianism and Taoism, both born in times when war was common in China, both of those have precepts of compassion. In Hinduism, there's the teaching about ahimsa, refraining from harming others, which is usually interpreted as a positive requirement to do that which will not cause harm to others. Jainism takes ahimsa further and requires one to act so as not to injure any life. In the so-called Abrahamic religions of the West, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, God is often called the Father of compassion. Judaism's many ethical commandments are often about protecting the weak, the vulnerable, and the stranger. The Golden Rule, which Rabbi Hillel identified as the whole Torah, is found first in Jewish teachings and then stressed by Jesus. Love your neighbor is an ancient Jewish teaching, and in Christianity, in the book called Matthew, Jesus is reported to have said, "You have heard it said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." Given that Christianity believes that prayer has an effect, that maxim is actually about compassionate action within Christianity. Christianity also has the story of the Good Samaritan, the idea that being good is helping others, even people who your society considers to be outsiders. In the Quran, compassion and justice are believed to be central attributes of Allah, and acting to protect the poor and those who are most vulnerable are important ethical precepts. While it is also true that religions are the source of much suffering and oppression, especially when one's neighbor, whom one is supposed to love, is defined very narrowly, it is in these teachings about compassion that reformers have found ways to call these religions to account. In 2009, the religious scholar Karen Armstrong developed and promoted something she called the International Charter of Compassion. It began with this statement: "The principle of compassion lies at the heart of all religious, ethical, and spiritual traditions, calling us always to treat all others as we wish to be treated ourselves. Compassion impels us to work tirelessly to alleviate the suffering of our fellow creatures, to dethrone ourselves from the center of our world, and to put another there, and to honor the sanctity of every single human being, treating everybody without exception with absolute justice, equity, and respect." This Charter for Compassion called on all people of the world to restore compassion to the center of religion and to teach accurately about other traditions, religions, and cultures, appreciating the positive aspects, as well as holding religions responsible to the aspirations of compassion. That charter closed with these words: "We urgently need to make compassion a clear, luminous, and dynamic force in our polarized world. Rooted in a principled determination to transcend selfishness, compassion can break down political, dogmatic, ideological, and religious boundaries. Born of our deep interdependence, compassion is essential to human relationships and to a fulfilled humanity. It is the path to enlightenment and indispensable to the creation of a just economy and a peaceful global community." And I believe that this is also true of a humanist philosophy or worldview. Born of our deep interdependence, compassion is, excuse me a second. Born of our deep interdependence, compassion is essential to human relationship and to a fulfilled humanity. Sorry. I'll be fine in just a minute. A world which used to embody what I'm calling compassion, a word which used to embody what I'm calling compassion is pity. But pity has come to have a very different connotation. Pity, as I understand the nature of the word, is an impulse to relieve immediate pain in others. But it is more about acting to be relieved ourselves of the triggered pain in us. Pity teaches us to create actions that are more about the immediate relief of the other person. I would maintain that compassion is more likely to push us to action that looks toward deeper, longer-term answers. In the story I told at the beginning, pity would move a person to console the family whose child is drowning, or maybe to create a monument to the child who drowned. Compassion moves a person to rescue the child. There's another parable about compassion versus pity that is also a story about drowning. Perhaps you've heard it. A monk stands at the side of a river. He has noticed that there are babies floating downstream in the water, and he's just barely able to keep up with pulling each one of them out and rescuing them. Another monk comes by, and the first one asks him for help. And the second monk continues walking, much to the disgust of the monk who is helping the children out of the stream. But the second monk continues up the stream to find the person who is throwing babies into the water, and then to stop that person. The second monk noticed that the first monk was able, although only barely, to rescue those already in the water. So he moved upstream to do what he could to stop babies from being thrown into the water. Pity can cause us sometimes to rescue those in immediate danger. But compassion, I believe, can motivate us as well to think about and take action against the causes behind that pain. Thus, compassion is behind many of the world's great social justice movements. I hear on the news that at least part of Haiti may be in for another destructive hurricane this week. And this society has a history of helping the people of Haiti. It is one thing to give aid to the people in Haiti who are now currently suffering. Like that first monk, someone needs to react to do what we can to help those in immediate need to survive. That can be moved by pity or compassion. But compassion calls the world to do more for Haiti, to help rebuild communities and continue to build an economy and political system that can be more sustainable in the future. For me, those words at the end of the Charter for Compassion, the creation of a just economy and a peaceful global community, sum up what compassion calls us to do on a social scale. We may differ on what a just economy is and how to get there. We may differ on what a peaceful global community means and how to get there. But I'm convinced that if we let loose our own compassion, our urge to act out of concern plus empathy, we will find ourselves on the path to creating that more humane world that is the goal of ethical humanism. Well, this talk would not be complete if I didn't also talk a little bit about compassion fatigue. This phrase has been around since about 1981. It's first found referring to how people were getting tired at that time about talking about immigration reform. And then in the 90s, it was used when people got tired of talking about homelessness. The issues seem to lead to an almost social version of depression. Compassion fatigue has been used to describe the situation as well of caregivers in health situations. It can lead to depression in the caregiver, even abuse of the person being cared for. More recently, it's been used to describe the documented effects of donations, especially when there's a lot of media coverage of major disasters. In those cases, compassion fatigue results in suspicions about where donations are going and what they'll be used for, and a general inertia and lowered giving rate. The symptoms of compassion fatigue. We have an experience of stress, trauma, and even depression, which makes it difficult to act or make decisions. We just are dead tired of trying to deal with the issue when we see very little happens. I believe that compassion fatigue results when we operate more out of pity than understanding and care, where we address symptoms but not causes, when we focus our efforts on ameliorating pain and suffering and not on changing what is causing the pain and suffering. Avoiding compassion can also numb us, and perhaps compassion fatigue is really about being unable to figure out how to apply our compassion urges effectively. My guess is that the answer to compassion fatigue is in the story of the two monks. The first monk was getting very tired of taking the babies out of the water. He wanted help and may have even been irritated or angry when he saw that the second monk would not help him. So I also want to talk a little bit about philosophy. The philosopher Immanuel Kant, who was one of the key philosophical inspirations of Felix Adler, taught the idea of treating every human being as an end in themselves, not merely a means to our ends. There were echoes of that in that charter of compassion. And this also relates to the compassion versus pity differentiation. If we act to relieve another's pain because we don't like seeing and hearing about it, we're using that other as a mere means to our relief. If we act out of recognition that that person is a full and equal human being in themselves, and we want to act for their sake, we're more likely to be acting in an ethical and effective manner. The philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, who lived just a little bit later than Kant, also wrote on moral theory. Schopenhauer thought that Kant was too rational, that reason could be used to figure out how to apply our impulses to help, but that our will and our feelings are not rational. Schopenhauer's basic moral theory looked at the reasons that people tend to act in the world. Some act out of self-interest, disconnected from the needs of others, which he called egotism. Acting out of pity can be a kind of egotism if it doesn't really consider what the other really needs. Some people he saw as acting out of malice, a wish to punish or hurt others. Today, we recognize that such malice is usually another kind of egotism. It is a tragic belief that if we hurt others, we will relieve our own pain. And others he saw as acting out of compassion, a true concern for others, whether or not it was in one's own self-interest. Schopenhauer saw egotism and malice as corrupt or mistaken ethics. He saw compassion as the moral path. And I would agree, hard as it is sometimes, the heart of ethics is compassion, that urge that we feel rooted in empathy for another when we care enough to protect or save or relieve the suffering of that person. And not as a calculus of what's in it for me. Though there may be a calculus where communities with more kindness and compassion are more likely to thrive. A recent philosopher I would add is Bell Hooks. She defines working to eradicate domination, and I would say for any domination, as rooted in the sense of equality of the other, of all others. To oppose systems of domination is, in words you heard in the quote this morning, a struggle rooted in the longing to make the world where everyone can live fully and freely. So, what do we do with this? I want to repeat those words of the Charter of Compassion. We urgently need to make compassion a clear, luminous, and dynamic force in our polarized world. Rooted in a principled determination to transcend selfishness, compassion can break down political, dogmatic, ideological, and religious boundaries. Born of our deep interdependence, compassion is essential to human relationships and to a fulfilled humanity. It is the path to enlightenment and indispensable to the creation of a just economy and a peaceful global community. And I would add from that quote by Bell Hooks, let us heighten our awareness, deepen our compassion, intensify our courage, and strengthen our commitment. So my request of you is this, to look at ways in which you can increase the times you act on your compassion instead of arguing yourself out of it. Allowing yourself to be limited by the boundaries of dogma or ideology, or acting more out of pity and wanting to relieve your own pain in sympathy rather than working for the long term. I want to live in a world where some people pull children out of lakes, even at risk to themselves. I want to live in a world where some go upstream and stop the actions of those who would endanger children in the first place. How can you help work to make compassion a clear, luminous, and dynamic force in our polarized world? I leave that to you. What is your urge, and what will you do? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joan.